Hi, my name is Tot, and I'm going to be talking to you about the Neogene period. So the Neogene period encompasses about 33 million years ago to 2.6 million years ago, and it includes the Miocene and the Pliocene epoch. As well, it was the second of two periods that mark our current era, which is the Cenozoic, and the beginning at the end of the Paleogene period. Another cool fact about the Neogene period, well, Neogene actually means the newborn, which basically is the sign, and it was put to emphasize the marine and terrestrial fossils that were found in the strata at this time that were more closely related to each other than those of the preceding period. As well, so you may be wondering, how was the tectonic history during this time? Well, a lot of things happened, which explain a lot of the things that we see today. During this era, the mountains rose and levels fell, and the continents that were separated started crashing into each other. So eventually, and it continued to slowly collision with Asia, which started and pushed up the Himalayas, which is still continuing on today because it grows about, I think, a centimeter each year. And then Italy pushed into Europe, which gave the rise to the Alps, and Spain butted into France, and then the Pyrenees rose. Other things that happened was the faulting and stretching and thinning of the parts of the Rocky, the Sierra Nevada, the Cascade Mountains in North America. And also the Arctic ice cap grew and thickened, which made the snow fall and onto the high mountains, which locked the water from the oceans. With that said, the sea levels actually plummeted, exposing the land bridges between Africa and Eurasia, and they merged with North America, which formed the Isthmus of Panama. And all this information I am getting from the National Geographic website. Adding on, the most significant thing that happened during this era was the unification of North America and South America. And this I am getting from the New Encyclopedia. Besides the tectonic history that happened during the Neogene era, other things happened, such as the global climate. And what happened during this era, it was that the climate cooled down and it dried, which forced the species that were living in there to adapt to it, or essentially die. But most of the species that were there adapted and grew a lot of new traits, which I would get into in a little bit, but I will tell you a little bit more about the climate. So, as I said, the climate cooled down and it was really dried. And during this period, it accumulated into the continental glaciations, and which basically saw the dawn of the genus Homo. And again, all this information I'm getting from the National Geographic and the New World Encyclopedia. And sorry, I know this is a little bit too much, but it's pretty cool and interesting stuff. So like I mentioned, since the climate was very cooled and dried, and it circulated the water patterns that contributed to the drier and cooler climate, it forced the species to develop, to find new traits, the survival of the fittest, if you may say. So some of the things that changed during this time, the type of life that was present, which was mostly mammals, was their traits once more. And during this era, the ones that evolved considerably were the mammals and the birds, and most of the other forms were relatively unchanged. Again, this is I'm getting from the New World Encyclopedia, and I am getting from the National Geographic website. So, a lot of the things that we see are the elephants, apes, rabbits, pigs, rhinos, and ground sloths started migrating to South America, to North America, Africa, Eurasia, all these other continents that back in the day they weren't in, they started migrating there because of the climate change. Again, going back into the survival of the fittest, they were trying to adapt, and if they couldn't adapt, they were migrating to a place that they already knew that they had a form of. So you see a lot of species migrating over to different continents. But some of the things that happened, like I told you, was that the great forests separated the continents from shore to shore, the grasslands were caving, and the habitat suited like a little cooler and drier weather, which developed a hardiness that came with less nutrition, and the plant-eating animals had to adapt to survive. So some of the mammals that adapted were horses. They evolved stronger. They developed a protective teeth and flourished. and so did the ruminants such as bison, camels, sheep, giraffes that were compartmentalized with stomachs and adapted as well to digesting grass. So a lot of these mammals that were here, and a lot of the animals that were living during this era, they had to adapt to being vegetarians. They had to adapt to eat new things and not rely on what they used to eat upon. So again, adding on, there were the grazers that were quick and roamed in herds. The new tricks of the survival were out in the open, and their predators were also forced to adapt for this reason. And one thing that we've seen during the ocean is that there was a brown algae called kelp that started growing and latching onto the rocks and corals in the shallow waters, which established a new habitat that was favored by the sea otters and dugongs and marine mammals related to the elephant. Another cool thing that happened during this era was that the sharks grew bigger and dominated the seas once again. So one of the sharks that was one of the biggest shark ever during this era was the megalodon, and it was nearly 50 feet long, which is about 15 meters. On the other hand, there were Asian and African apes that diverged, and then several million years later, the hominids split from their closest African ape ancestors and the chimpanzees, and they adapted to two-footed walking. But again, this was possible because of the migration that happened during this era. There was a lot of species that had to go, find new places to live in, find places that they could adapt to easily, and it was just all the survival of the fittest. So how do we know this information? How do we come about these interesting facts, right? So one of the things that led us to believe this is the fossils that were found. And this was, I'm getting this information from the Hobart University. So most of the fossils that were found during this era gave away to how the adaptation was given, how a lot of animals evolved, and how they migrated to different continents, because you found these fossils in a certain place, and now all of a sudden you're finding them in a whole new different place. So that led us to believe that there was migration happening during this era, especially for adaptation. As well, the countries that were merging together. We learned about tectonic history last week, or 2 weeks ago, and it explained to us how the rocks, how the continents that mash together, we can tell by the way that the rocks are formed, by the way that the layers are, and how deep they are, how old they are, etc. So eventually, that tectonic knowledge helps us in knowing how the continents are moving, and because the continents are moving, we can tell that they were mashing together, how the Himalayas was started, how the Alps was began, the Pyrenees rose, etc. All those things we learn through the tectonic knowledge that we have in hand. Above that, the climate as well is brought upon through the minerals that are found in the rocks, how what their age are like, what degrees they were habiting in. All that helps with us learning how the climate was back in the day during the Neogene system. Above that, other things about the Neogene system was that it was an era full of change. It was an era full of migration, and in all, it helped develop the world that we live in today. Because now we have the beautiful Himalayas, now we have the beautiful Alps, the Pyrenees. We have all these things that we can look at, and all this was started in the Neogene era. It developed furthermore, obviously, but this is how it all began. I hope this was of interest to you, and you really liked this talk, and you learned a little bit more about the Neogene period. Thank you.